Right, welcome back. Second video. Moving on now to looking at the reasons for the distribution of global undernourishment, or as we said before, food insecurity. So we looked at where you find food insecurity and where you find a food security. We know that in the north of the world that you're less likely to be suffering from undernourishment or food insecurity, and Africa is probably suffering the most undernourishment or the greatest levels of food insecurity. But there are several reasons for this. Okay, so we're going to look at the human and the physical reasons. So first of all, you've got your levels of development. Okay, so effectively what this is referring to is the amount of money you have. All right, so if you're talking about development, you're talking about how wealthy your country is. And countries like the UK, the USA, well, they began their development round about in the 1850s, 1800s, 1850s. So they've been developed for a long time. At the same sort of time, most of the people in Africa around here were being colonized by the British, so they are having their land taken from them. But because we were wealthy, we've managed to invest that money and we've managed to put it into technology. Okay, now technology does one of two things. It effectively makes farming easier. Think about tractors, think about the chemicals. And if we make farming easier, it equals more food. All right, so there's more food to go around the population. Because we were able to do that quite quickly, it meant that our country was well fed. A well fed country means that you've then got a healthy population. Healthy population will be able to work harder, brings in more money, and so forth. What it also meant was that any food that we had, that we could then start to sell to other countries and then take that money back and reinvest it. But when we're talking about technology, we are talking about things like combine harvesters, tractors, machinery that makes the job easier, machinery in factories, which is then processing the food, and obviously chemicals like pesticides, which means that the crops that we could do grow in this country, well, they're not going to be killed off by bugs and by bacteria and germs. And obviously we can then start to put fertilizers and chemicals on them to make them grow better. And we've started to look at genetically modified crops as well, which is a bit of a controversial point, but we don't really talk about that one too much. Okay, so there's the first one. You've got your technology. The second point is your geographical location. All right, so we just put a ring around that in there. I'm going to take that off there. Okay, so geographical location. Now, we've already spoken about the location of the most undernourished countries which are experiencing the worst food security. And you probably think, well, what is it about Africa that makes it so? Okay, so if we're thinking about physical location, the one that we want to look at really is kind of that area. So sorry about that. I'm just going to come back and get rid of that one there. So we were looking at this area here, the larger oblong shape, where we've looked at Africa and Asia, and we've looked at this area here, which we would call sub-Saharan Africa. And what we're looking at in terms of geographical location, the first thing is we could be talking about the climate, okay? And we know that these countries typically will have hot and dry seasons, which makes it very difficult for crops to grow. They may have storms in southern Asia, so they get the storms every year, which obviously leads to crops being washed away, soil being washed away. But obviously in this part of Africa here, it makes it incredibly hard to make crops grow because there's a lack of water. What you could also be talking about is poor soil. Okay, if you've got really poor soil, then crops just will not grow in it. Okay, some of the soil here is very sandy, lack of nutrients, and therefore you can't grow staple foods like maize and corn and wheat to make bread and food with, because it just will not grow. If you were to consider countries like this one here, that's Nepal and Bhutan, and to some extent Afghanistan and Pakistan as well, then you have now got mountains. Okay, and the mountains make it incredibly hard for you to grow your crops with. It makes it very hard to grow any food with at all, and therefore it is very, very hard to provide food for your country, and therefore you're looking at food security. And the other point about these two countries in here is that they are what we would refer to as landlocked, which means not only are they surrounded by the countries, they are also surrounded by mountains. Now, these countries in here are landlocked. Okay, look at Zambia. We talked about that earlier on. Zambia is landlocked as well. And the difficulty when you've got a landlocked country is you have got no coastline. So if you have no coastline, it equals, it becomes very hard to import food into the country. So therefore, what we've then got is a situation where you just can't get food in. When you combine that with the level of development, okay, if you're a poor country with a landlocked, importing food is difficult. And your level of wealth also links to how much food you can import. England, in the UK, well, we get things like beef comes over from Argentina, we get corn from over in America, we get lamb from New Zealand. So we get food from everywhere. If I lived in Zambia, I'd either have to grow the food myself or get it from a neighbour. I cannot import it from other parts of the world. It's just very, very difficult for some of these landlocked countries to actually obtain the food that they need for their population. So I'm just going to get rid of this because we've got two more left to do. I'll get rid of the rest of that in just a second. Right, so the next one is obviously population. And you know, there's two things about population which affect your food security: population size and growth rate. And we're going to refer to India again. Okay, so India is just in here. India is the second largest population with roughly 1 billion people, but it is the fastest growing. Okay. And the same can also be said in Africa. Nigeria, which is here, is also one of the fastest growing populations within Africa. Now, their food insecurity is pretty low. Okay, they've got a coastline; they can import food very, very quickly. In fact, they export a lot of food from Nigeria. But their population has grown by 50% in roughly 50 years. Okay, it has grown hugely in that time. Now, clearly, the bigger the population, the more food you're going to need, but the faster the growing population, well, that presents a different problem because it means that you may not be able to provide the food quick enough for the amount that the country needs to consume. So think about that. Population, I'm going to write it up here nice and tidily again, size and growth. Now, I'm not saying that a country with a small population is going to be any better off. It may be. But again, looking at here, Nepal is a very small population. It still has got high levels of food insecurity. So there are other combinations of factors available which will affect the levels of global undernourishment. Climate change. Obviously a massive factor at the moment. The two aspects of climate change that you need to consider are the effects of global warming, specifically in areas around Africa and Asia. These are going to be the two areas which are affected by global warming. So the rising temperatures may mean stronger levels of sunlight, and therefore crops are drying out. You've got reduced rainfall, not everywhere, but in parts of the world you have got reduced rainfall. And one of the countries which is most at risk is this little tiny one in here, get rid of that menu, called Bangladesh. Okay, Bangladesh is suffering from sea level rise as a result, and a lot of where it grows its crops and its food is grown on flat land which is close to the sea. Sea level rise is literally washing those fields away now. The problem with Bangladesh is it's 65% at sea level. So as you can imagine, as the sea level rises, the country is going to flood, and therefore what we also get is a lack of food, nutrition. People are going to be undernourished, and they're not going to have enough food to go around. So food security is going to be a massive issue in Bangladesh in the future. Right, it's going to move on. So now what you've got. What I'd like you to do is potentially go back, wind back, rewatch that, but basically just make a list of the reasons for uneven levels of global food security. So if you were to just put climate change in here, you can have this one. Climate change is one reason, and the basic definition is hotter and drier temperature. That's wrong. Climate it should be. Sorry. Hotter and drier climate equals less crop growth. Okay, so just basically 1 point and 1 sentence in there at all. I'm going to pause the video and let you do that now. Okay, so the task attached to those would be to outline 2 reasons why there is global distribution of undernourishment. I'm mixing the words up on purpose because you're either going to find undernourishment, undernutrition, or you're going to find food security. So get used to using all 3 terms. Right, so outline 2 reasons why there is an uneven distribution. It's worth 4 marks. So effectively, that's 2 for that one and 2 for that one. And the way that the marking will be distributed is 1 reason and 1 explanation. All right. Now, simply, you just need to put one of the things that you've just talked about and 1 full explanation, but it's got to link to explain why undernourishment is occurring. You can't just say climate change will mean that there's less crops being grown. That's not answering why that leads to undernourishment. The crops are being used to produce food for people within the country, and therefore less crops will mean there's less food to go around. I'm just going to pause the video now, and I'm going to let you have a go at doing those 2 questions. You should take 4 minutes for it, for 4 marks, and I'm going to give you a model answer after so you can mark yours. Right, so my response would be, let's come back, sorry. My response could be 2 reasons why there is an uneven distribution of undernourishment. Okay, so I'm going to write population size. Okay, and my reason, when a country has a large and fast growing population, it can mean there is not enough food to go around. I would say to go around for the population. Okay, so what I've done there, I've given you my point, and then this is me quantifying it, and then therefore I've led it back to undernourishment there. All right. The final point I would make is that if you use population in here, so you need to use something totally different down here. You should be using something like climate. You should be looking at geographical location. Please make sure when there's a 2-part 4-mark question, they are 2 totally different responses. Okay, don't use population size and population growth. Otherwise, you'll only probably achieve 2 marks out of 4 for that one. Right, I'm now going to make the last installation of the video. Mark yourself there, upload your answers, and the last one's going to be a lot shorter. Thank you.